Hello, I'm really thankful to the Institute and the International Office, to the Zentrum für Angewandte. My German is not so good, but thanks for inviting me for this lovely lecture, and which is, I know, a kind of series of lectures that have been going on for a long time, I suppose. And I'm really happy to be part of it, part of this organization, which requires, which aims to shift the perception of people in Germany about immigrants and maybe refugee scholars, because by sharing with us our research and research conclusions, and by seeing our research side and academic side, that might hopefully give a big impact on German academic culture as well, I would say. As in the lovely introduction that have been done by Professor before me, I have been working on neoliberalism quite a long time, but my subject has been changed throughout the changes that occurred in Turkish politics as well. As you know, recently there is a big important rise in authoritarianism in Turkey, and after, in parallel with this rise, I start focusing on the impacts of this change, political change, on body politics and gender politics and women's life in Turkey. Today I will share some of my results of my research that I've been doing for the last 2 years since I moved to France and then to Germany. And this is part of my project. It's not the whole outcome of my research, but you can understand the general framework of my research through this presentation. The aim and principles that I rely on in my research basically requires me to understand one of the main contradictory points that occurred in Turkey. To what extent, although there is a really strong feminist movement in Turkey, and according to their claim, these feminist scholars and activists claim, the AKP is very much relying on conservative body politics or gender politics in general terms. However, this fact, on the contrary to this fact, there is an also very important support of women in Turkey to AKP politics. So how come this can happen? This is my basic question that I moved from. And in order to understand this contradictory situation, I decided to use different theoretical framework. Instead of looking at only negative aspects of the AKP politics, especially in the first period of its reformist, what I call reformist period, I try to understand its constitutive and positive aspect as well in relation to women and women experiences. And, and also I try to see the complexity that exists within this political struggle that AKP was trying to carry on from the moment that it came to power until now. So this complexity forced me to understand contradictory and complex nature of AKP discourse. Rather than understanding the AKP in only one aspect, in respect to only one negative aspect, I try to understand more complexity, in terms of complexity. So this is my basic starting point in theoretical terms. And in the second point that I really made and took very seriously, that was to take the AKP's political struggle not only as fixed social project or political project, but more placing it into time and place. In terms of understanding Turkey as a part of global conjuncture, and also understanding the struggle for hegemony of the AKP as a kind of change, not only static ongoing struggle for power, but also it includes some change and shifts in its discourse and political rhetorics. When we look at, from this perspective, when we look at AKP's politics in general, what we see, particularly in the first period, a kind of articulation of different discourses and narratives, not only about women's body and sexuality, but generally about concepts, liberal concepts like rights and choice. So actually it is very contradictory and complex in the sense that it articulates different narratives coming from Islam, but also conservative political tradition, but also liberal kind of tradition, political tradition, and it amalgams that all this into a kind of different modality of politics. So, but in this perspective, when we look at the AKP as a kind of patchwork, we see in the first period that AKP used liberalism more connotative aspect of its discourse, which means the liberalism was main underlying or framing general discourse that articulated other narratives that were coming from, for instance, Islam or conservatism, nationalism, etc. And in this first period of AKP, what we see that was a rise in global conjuncture, a rise in the more liberal wings were in the air, in other words. And there was what was dominant form of neoliberalism generally in the global conjuncture was neoliberalism with a human face. That was not my conception, but by Molinex, who considered neoliberalism, for instance, in respect to England and in respect to USA, as a kind of neoliberalism with a human face, which emerged as a strong model, especially during the 1990s in Europe. But in Turkey, the reflection of this wave, this political wave, came into being in the early 2000s, late 1990s, and it emerged in the form of kind of conservative democracy. That is the name that Erdogan used to describe its own project in the earlier period. So it carried out a kind of democratic face, which was very strong and appealing to many different sections of society, including some liberals, some conservatives, but also some liberals, even some part of lefts, especially new lefts. And in some respects, it was even there we can talk about not a coalition, but a kind of atmosphere, positive atmosphere within which different social movements interact with each other. Like Islamic movement was interaction with feminism in a strange way. There was tension between the two, but at the same time they shared similar or common discursive fields in the way that they both criticized Kemalist modernist project that was coming from the earlier nation-state notion, a notion that was very strong in the early period of Turkish Republic. So, in criticizing this old nation-state modernist project, Islamic movement was very strongly on the side of postmodern conservative views about what should we do about this old modernization project. And from another perspective, feminists and women's movement was also critical about the same project and opening up criticism in terms of including women into modernization. And also, another strong movement, Kurdish movement, was also in the uprising in the same period. And they were also looking for an expansion of the existing modernization project via including Kurds as a new social and political actors in the scene. So within this context, actually AKP was a kind of in favor of identity politics that was dominant in that time. So this was a kind of global conjuncture, or I call local conjuncture, in which AKP actually could become a kind of more democrat in its own conservatism. So, so we can conclude from this introduction that AKP's gender politics was not only restrictive and suppressive, but also productive and constitutive. Not only in the sense that it brought some identity politics as a kind of political background for its own struggle, but also positioning some or constituting some kind of new modes of subjectivities for women, for Kurds, for conservative sections of society, etc. So it's productive in other sense as well, like it was very reformative, as we will see later on, and putting lots of reforms into action, so on and so forth. AKP's neoliberal gender politics has not only operated by curtailing the social aspect of the state, which was the case, obviously, as it was the case in many other countries, including even Germany to some extent, but also by suppressing women's sexualities and bodies, not only by curtailing the social aspect of the state and by suppressing women's sexualities and bodies, but by also constructing new modes of gender subjectivities, as well as mobilizing popular fears and desires. So this is a very quick early outcome that we can underline. In what way this is productivity, this understanding of productivity might be opened up? First of all, I can underline, as I said before, I can underline reforms that have been carried out by the AKP in its earlier period. AKP, under the push of being in the process of EU member, that was very important political motivation, signed and made important amendments in certain laws, like and this brought into being some legislative reforms and reforms in general regulations, etc. It included labor law, but also other laws related to violence against movement, and an important constitutional change which might be underlined as well that have been carried out between 2004 and 2010. So they try to create their own way of dealing with the gender issue. They try to create a kind of picture to both to the West part of the world, but also to its own national citizens, that it was modernist, as opposed to what has been claimed about generally religious conservative people in Turkey and on political parties in Turkey. AKP claimed that it was modernist and brought into a new kind of modernism, which was affiliated with Islamism too. There we can talk about other important attempts that have been done by the government at that time, but I like to underline two main points, especially related to its use of the concept of equality. I mean, in this period, when we look at in details the AKP's reforms, when we look at in details, we quite often come across with the concept of equality and right within the context of course, gender politics. But when we dig this concept more into deeper, we come to the limits of the same concept. That one reason for the limitation that limitation of this concept was related to its other side, related to conservatism, but also that was very liberal in its own notion. I mean, in its own character, the way how they use these concepts was very liberal in the sense that it was far away from seeing very important structure within which women were in Turkey. So they were declassifying the concept of women in that context and diminishing the problems that was related to class issue, especially poor women who were underclass women or lower class women who were in deeper problems, was not very easily seen by these reform programs. Despite they were also trying to reach to those women by direct aids projects, so which were supported by different international NGOs of that time. So they created kind of new subject position for women who are in the need of the AKP by putting kind of new form of clientelist relationship which is based upon a direct money transfer by the AKP itself to certain poor sections of women. And on the other side, they created another subjective position for women who can help those women by opening up new NGOs which were directly connected to the government itself. And those NGOs were mainly run by women who are fond of the AKP. So that was a new area through which conservative women could enter into public sphere, which was mainly very much secular and very exclusive to Islamic identities before. So in that sense, the AKP was very productive and very constitutive in more Foucauldian sense of power. If you think through these terms, you can understand that AKP did not only limit certain subjectivities or suppress women's bodies and identities, but more opened up new subject positions in the public sphere. So, in the first period, one of the main strategies that was used by the AKP was de-emphasizing conservative conception of femininity and female sexuality. They did not emphasize their own conservative view and conception about what is the true women's sexuality, what they have to be, in what way they have to be morally constructed. In what way women's sexuality should have been morally understood. They didn't emphasize this. So what they did instead, for instance, previous conservative parties were very much interested in the subject of headscarf, but AKP did not in the first period. AKP intentionally and strategically did not touch upon this political heated issue in public discourses. And in fact, there was a kind of implicit consensus among conservative women in society in general, conservative female intellectuals, and conservative AKP female members on this strategy. This was not only invented by the AKP itself, but there was a kind of social tendency to not to get into a kind of conflictual politics on these matters. So, and that time, within this context, AKP also followed this social tendency, socio-political tendency, let's put it in this way, and used the strategy of de-emphasizing. However, what we came in the later period in 2000s, towards the end of 2000s, we start seeing AKP in another position. But in generally, I mean, in Germany as well and in Turkey too, this is generally embodied in this male image of Erdogan, kind of hatred that is created against him. But in fact, when we look at the political process by putting it into time and place, as I said before, we see that there was a huge conjunctural shift in the political area in Turkey. So AKP did not change its own position from liberal to more authoritarian, only by the need of power of the Erdogan, but more under the pressure of new conjuncture within which Turkey was taking place at that time. What can we talk about this political conjuncture? What can we say about this new political conjuncture? First of all, the EU process was very unsuccessful for both sides. So AKP did certain reform, but when it came to the point of applying the reforms themselves, the project was started to shake. It was mingling. I mean, they couldn't stabilize the political position that they were in before, because they were not capable of, because of the conservative and neoliberal limitation, they were not capable of really and truly applying all reforms in actual practice. So, but at the same time, EU's position has changed too. I mean, within the EU, there had been certain question marks about the membership of Turkey in many ways. We can talk about this later, but in generally, I mean, the relationship between EU and Turkey has changed. But also, there has been an increasing social and political demands that was raised by the social movements that I mentioned before, like feminism and Kurdish politics, were really importantly engaged into Turkish politics at that time. And they came to the point of demanding the results of their struggle. Like Kurdish movement were on the moment of either continuing to peace process or giving up and searching for another radical solution. So in that moment, actually, first AKP came with a reformist step, and asked for the peace process and put a table for the peace process, calling Kurdish movement's leaders into the scene. However, because of the radicalization of all these demands, AKP, forced by the social demands and social movements to its limits. So they couldn't again realize the actual practice. So, and also there was an important moment, the moment of constitutional amendment. So AKP, instead of continuing and increasing its own power within the society, what AKP made as a strategic move, it turned into the state and started to rebuild the state formation. So now in the second period, which starts around 2007, but mainly becomes visible and more stronger in around 2010, AKP focused on the state as a political struggle and as a field of struggle, What they attempted to change the balance of power groups within the state itself and marginalized, for instance, military power, marginalized Kemalist, old nationalist military groups within the state itself. So as it gains more and more power within the state, the struggle among the AKP coalition groups began to increase. So that was another problem that occurred in 2000, in the later period of AKP. So also, I mean, there had been an increasing war conjuncture. Of course, Turkey was very close to. In the Middle East, the war was getting heated and approaching to Turkey step by step. So AKP was also very much under the influence by the internal political problems and made wrong decisions about international politics in general. So when we look at all these new conditions, AKP had to, instead of going on this reformist pattern, it shifted to more nationalist and conservative groups, and it changed the coalition, the whole political character of political coalition, which AKP was based on. And in the new political coalition group, there was extreme nationalists, very deep military groups which were against Kurdish movement, and some extreme other groups, conservative groups, included into the new coalition. So from then on, AKP began to use a new phrase for its own project. Instead of conservative democrat, it started to name its own position as one flag, one nation. One flag, one nation means actually two nations, according to Jessup's concepts. Two nations means that the nation was split into two, and one side was on the side of the power group, and the other was called as terrorists, immorals, etc., etc. So this splitting and this new political project and this new political coalition actually was very strongly against certain groups within the society itself, including feminists, reformists, liberals, Kurds, etc. And of course, Gülen's community was also was put into the list later on. And from then on, the body politics, the definition of sexuality and femininity became a kind of political symbol that was used to consolidate this new coalition, to consolidate the power of this new coalition over the other part of nation. From then on, they started to curtail women's rights issue, and they focused on more conservative understanding of femininity and feminine sexuality. They start using hate scarf as a symbol again, and serve this symbol into the public discussion. For instance, they changed the constitution and lifted up the ban on headscarf. But this was kind of, again, returning back to the 1990s for Turkey. And the clash between secularist and Islamic emerged again. So instead of kind of coalition politics which included hegemonic politics which included different parts of the social sectors, now what we could see, the kind of new politics of hate, that is Rancière's conception. I call this period kind of post-feminist period, in which it's a terrain in which different kind of discursive argumentation we can see and follow. Argumentation that is kind of anti-feminist, and as well as postmodernist, post-foundationalist moves to destabilize and deconstruct gender. Liberal and neoliberal feminism can also be seen in the same terrain at the same time, simultaneously with other positions. And we can also see kind of feminisms which are more international in its character. But also, if I may use Ringrose understanding of what post-feminism is, I can also refer to kind of movements like backlash, cultural diffusion, repressive anxiety over shifting gender orders that were all there in Turkish cultural context in that period. And actually AKP began to refer all this, began to appeal all these fears and questions about maybe we went too far in democratic sense. We went too far to give the opportunity for Kurds to involve into that political scene, or feminists to be seen themselves as legitimate political actors. These were all questions about the present political actors in Turkey, and these kind of questions became very dominant recently. And I believe AKP used all these fears, public, political, and popular fears, to turn them into its own discourse. And for instance, we see in that period that abortion debate has emerged, and suddenly Erdogan made a claim that he wants to abandon the law on abortion, and for him, he said that it's a kind of crime and to have an abortion. So this conservative view began more and more dominant in public discourses. Also, they start talking about student cohabitation and problematize this situation in Turkey. I mean, in many cities where universities are, students can stay, of course, as different sexes. Female and male might stay together in the same flat. Of course, Turkish culture is generally conservative, and not as conservative as Erdogan assumed, but still there had been a kind of conservatism exist in Turkey in sexual relationships or female-male relationships. But this has never been that much problematized publicly as Erdogan did. And Erdogan addressed to this cohabitation places or houses as a kind of places of sin. And he said that I will serve my policies to stop all this flat relationship. They will suddenly enter into their flats and stop living together, etc. That politicization, actually, criminalization of that kind of activities were very first for Turkey. And the age of marriage decreased to very young age for girls as well. And using headscarf was not simply the law banning the headscarf was lifted. Okay, no problem. But the new laws came after, allowing really small girls, like in primary schools, to wear headscarf in the school. So these are examples to show you the way how sexual politics have changed, and women body again became a dominant figure to explain the political project of the AKP, and also political strengthen and consolidate its power in the state and over society. Okay, thank you very much. That was what I wanted to share, but we can discuss in more detail what I try to express. Thank you.